Something more ought to be said about this business of the historians manufacturing talking points under the banner, the myth of the lost cause. There are many video clips available online of people telling us they are historians, offering credentials for the title, more or less, echoing the superficiality that Professor Carmichael exhibits in his shot at the expression. Some of them are boring, some roughly presented technically, and some highly polished professional spectacles of history professors pontificating about nothing more than their manufacturing out of the so-called myth of the lost cause, what they call its tenets. For you serious students looking for something more than a C grade on your paper, I want to show you some brief clips taken from 3 examples. The first presentation is boring, the second in need of a little polish, and the third a sparkling example of how speech, supported by professional technique and props, can make a bad case seem good. But first, let's get the basics in hand. The first of which is understanding what the meaning of the word cause is. The definition of the word, as all English words, encompasses shades of meaning. The first definition offered by Merriam and Webster is this: anything producing an effect or result. Second, a reason for some action. Third, any objective that a person is interested in. Fourth, a question to be resolved by a court of law. And we might add here a fifth, a question to be resolved by war. Now, with the definition in mind, let's see if we can intelligently figure out what these historians mean when they collectively use the phrase myth of the lost cause in relation to the Civil War. The first definition, anything producing an effect or result, points us to the question, what was the cause of the war? And necessarily to answer this question, we must distinguish between the war's immediate, efficient cause, that cause, in other words, most immediate to its happening, and the war's more remote cause, the first cause, or the cause that set the white people of the Union on a course that led them to the war. Well, all of you can see quickly, can't you, that disunion, the actual political act of a state announcing its secession from the Union, was the immediate, efficient cause of the war. Think of the British people's recent referendum that their state leave the European Union, and you have it. But how to identify the war's most remote cause, the first cause, the cause that set the people moving in their minds toward the war? Now, let me show you now a clip that expresses how the historians in lockstep present their answer to this question in the form of their exposition of the myth of the lost cause.
Next, historian Edward BoneKemper discusses his book, The Myth of the Lost Cause, Why the South Fought the Civil War and Why the North Won. It examines post-war arguments made by former Confederates seeking to justify their split from the Union and their defeat. Mr. BoneKemper argues that slavery, and not states' rights, was the primary reason for secession.
Now, John Keegan was an internationally recognized military historian, wrote about 20 military history books, and so he lived in England. To be honest, he did not understand the Civil War that well. He wrote a book on it eventually, and it was not a very good book. But in one of his other books on intelligence in war, he just made a general statement sort of off the cuff, and this is where historians run into trouble, and I do it myself all the time. You try to make a general statement about something which is tangential to what you're really writing about and what you really know about. And Keegan said, the Southern people were resolute in their determination to preserve states' rights, the legal issue over which they had declared separation. So he bought into what I consider to be the myth that states' rights was what the secession and the formation of the Confederacy were all about. So let's now springboard off of that, and let me tell you what I see as the major components of the myth. The first one I've just stated, and I think that's an absolutely critical one, slavery was not the primary cause. States' rights was the primary cause of the Civil War. I'm now talking on the left there. The myth goes on that slavery was a benign institution beneficial to whites and blacks alike. But then all of a sudden the myth jumps into something that sounds a little inconsistent with what I've just said, and it says, by the way, the Civil War was unnecessary because slavery was going to expire on its own within a fairly reasonable period of time. And we'll take a look at that. Further, the argument goes the South never had a chance to win the war, and one would ask, well, if that's so, then why did you start the war? And thus the South did the best it could with the resources that it had. And part of this then is that Robert E. Lee was the great military leader and that he was one of the greatest generals who ever lived.
So the fellow gives us, the historians, a general list of tenets for the myth of the lost cause they manufactured. 1. States' rights was the primary cause of the war. 2. Slavery, a good thing, would expire on its own in time. 3. The South never had a chance to win. Now, the fella here answers the definitional question by telling us that in abstraction, the political concept of states' rights was the primary cause, and by primary, we must take him to mean the first cause, the cause that set the people moving in their minds toward the war. But men do not fight for abstractions. They fight to protect themselves from a harm they cannot prevent without fighting, a harm to their homes, a harm to their country, a harm to their people. States' rights is a silly answer to the definitional question. Now let's look at a rougher presentation of essentially the same mantra.
Next, author Philip Greenwalt talks about how, at the end of the Civil War, Southerners grappled with the question of why the Confederacy lost. He argues that many of their writings served as the foundation for the lost cause. The emerging Civil War blog hosted this event. It's about 50 minutes.
Phil Greenwalt.
Good morning. Good thing about the lost cause is, or remembering Southern Confederate history, is that it has not been in the public eye at all in the last few weeks, months. I think I had to turn off my own social media accounts because I had to rewrite my introduction and conclusion 15, 20 times since yesterday. But now, the formation of the lost cause is an amazing cultural phenomenon that shaped our collective memory of one of the big turning points in American military, political, economic, social, history. But it started right here. April 9th, 1865, the gentleman that spoke before me, Mr. Kolakowski, I did not pay him to introduce my subject, but he did a great job. And after Robert E. Lee meets here in the parlor of the McLean House, he issues his farewell address, and in it are the tidbits of what would become one of the mantras of the lost cause. He, in quote, says, "The Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield by overwhelming numbers and resources." Later on, he commented and said, "But valor and devotion could accomplish nothing that could compensate for the loss of continuing the action." These are tidbits that explain what happened, why they got the Appomattox, why from 1861 to 1865 the causes of the war or the explanations of why they fought also matriculated through. So how could the Confederates explain why they fought, what they fought for, or the reasons that they succumbed in 1865? We have to remember, though, that what's happened in current affairs, what happened in popular culture today, has a whole different meaning and has taken the historic kernel of truth and popped it into unmanageable popcorn. With that said, how to explain, how to understand, how to remember the 4 bloodiest years in American military history. Jubal Early, a gentleman that I've studied a lot, a gentleman that I view as a poor man's version of Stonewall Jackson, said that, in quote, shortly after the war, "We all know how hard it is to eradicate early impressions." So he encouraged ex-Confederates to write about the war, to get the message out, to get the truth. As Robert E. Lee said, "My only object is to transmit, if possible, the truth to posterity and to do justice to our brave soldiers." And this was a letter he wrote in November of 1865. The guns had barely gone silent when Southerners of the former Confederacy began looking for reasons, looking for causes, and justifications for why the war went the way it did. How to explain how scenes went from this to this, or to explain how this euphoria in 1861 turned into this. One of the famous photos, the last few weeks of the war. These soldiers are captured from Pickett's division at Five Forks from April 1st, 1865. How to explain that 25% of Southern men were killed or incapacitated or scarred from the war. How that Southern economy, Southern civilians, the government of the Confederacy pumped in $3 billion to fight the war. And in 1865, it was in shambles. 4 million slaves were freed. The economic and cultural, the social ramifications of one out of every almost 3 people in the Southern Confederacy. Suddenly your labor force gone. Your cities destroyed. Well, cities destroyed. Atlanta, Columbia, Richmond. So even in a way, Southern manhood question. Why do we lose? Why could we mano a mano standing in the lines? How were we overcome? And what do we have to look forward to in the future? Some decided the best way to move out, the best way to remember, was literally to move. You have communities now in Montana called Verena, named after Verena Davis. You have an ex-Confederate soldier who did so much in his life that every time I study or feel like I'm slacking, I think about this gentleman who was born in 1799, fought in the Civil War because he had connections in the Carolinas, decided that, you know what, that wasn't arduous service enough. I'm going to head across country. And I'm going to, you know what, the Rocky Mountains don't seem too challenging. I'm going to traverse them. And then I'm going to get away from Yankeedom in Western Oregon, where he dies in the 1870s. This gentleman, though, is the one that first coined the lost cause, Edward Pollard. He was in charge of one of the 2 newspapers in Richmond, Virginia during the war. In 1864, he actually tried to head to Europe, but his privateer is captured by the Union Navy, and he spends time in Fort Warren up in Boston, Massachusetts. Pro-Confederate, anti-Jefferson Davis. He would write that it is time that the Southerners have thrown down the sword, but to take up the weapons of arguments and the creation of memorial societies.
As a matter of historical fact, Edward Pollard did not coin the phrase a lost cause, certainly not in the sense that the historians who have shaped our collective memory of the war have done. It was the title of a book he wrote in 1865. The full title of it is The Lost Cause, A New Southern History of the War of the Confederates, a full and authentic account of the rise and progress of the Southern Confederacy, the campaigns, battles, incidents, and adventures of the most gigantic struggle of the world's history. That is the theme of all Southern writing immediately after the war. And if you take a look at the contents of Pollard's book, and in those days, for each chapter, there's a long description of every detail that's included in the chapter. So, for example, Chapter 1, you're told you'll find out about the true value of the federal principle, historical examples, Coleridge's prophecy, early mission of the American Union, how it was terminated, the American system of government, a mixed one, the colonial period, etc., etc. Chapter 2, the federal principle ultimately fatal to the Union, other causes of disunion, the sectional animosity, the geographical line in the Union, how the differences between North and South produced 2 distinct communities instead of rival parties within one body politic, the theory of a political North and a political South, its early recognition in the Convention of 1787, the Declaration of Madison, etc., etc. None of this, when you read the reality of the actual literature in any rational way, supports the silliness these historians feed these audiences, all white audiences, by the way. Whether we're talking about the Smithsonian Institute, where the first gentleman was, or the McLean House, where the second gentleman is, or the third audience we're going to look at in a minute, they're all white people being lectured to by white professors who claim they have the true story to tell.
The topic of our second panel is the stream of memory of the war that is most often termed the lost cause, memory of the war. And we once again have three historians on the panel here. John Koski, Caroline Janney, and Ed Ayres will be our troupe this time. And I want to start by having the panel talk about just what the lost cause interpretation of the war meant. What are the principal tenets of the lost cause explanation for the coming of the war and the conduct of the war?
Before talking about the tenets, but I'm going to yield to Carrie on that. I think it's important that we talk about the origin of the term. It actually harkens back to Sir Walter Scott and the Jacobite Revolution or the Rebellion of 1745. So it has antecedents before the American Civil War. It's also important for people to realize that while we today tend to think of it as a somewhat pejorative term that we use as scholars looking back, it actually did originate during the war, and the term was used shortly after the war. To repeat just briefly, the lost cause actually, the term originated before the Civil War, and it was the greatest currency was from a book published in 1866 by Richmond editor E.A. Pollard, and it was a term that was used widely by former Confederates in that generation after the war. It is not some term that we, as historians, applied to it after the fact. And in fact, a magazine out of Louisville, Kentucky, one of these reminiscences magazines and popular magazines of former Confederates, was entitled The Lost Cause, with the masthead saying simply, defeated but not dishonored.
Well, the Lost Cause magazine, like the Confederate Veteran and other similar ones published after the war, primarily after 1890 up until about 1930, were basically reminiscences by Confederate veterans of their experiences in the war, or they contained articles written by ex-Confederate officers of their experiences during battles, crammed full of photographs that you would see in the classic set of Scribner magazines that were published in Philadelphia during the same period of time, battle scenes and battle maps. Very little material you can find in this string of magazines that contain the language that these historians use as if slavery was an issue, some sort of an argument made in this literature of the nature of the argument that these historians make. As far as the Lost Cause magazine is concerned, here are several paragraphs that reflect the essential theme of the literature, in which this theme has been adapted by the historians as they shape our collective memory. No brave man who fought in the Confederate armies can look upon his service in the glorious cause of the South other than with greatest pride. No war of any age, considering the troops engaged, the long list of battles, the number of killed, wounded, and dead, can compare with this American conflict. The vast territory over which the war spread, the destruction of property, and the desolation of homes stands unparalleled. In no other war has the intellectual or patriotic standard of soldiers equaled the civil conflict, and thus viewed in any aspect, the struggle of the Southland to be free takes the first place in all the wars fought by man since the world began. To have been connected with such armies, such a cause, and such leaders is a distinction which has come to only one generation of men, and properly arouses in the heart of every participant in that mighty struggle a sense of noblest pride. As this war is the greatest of all wars, in whatever view it may be considered, it therefore becomes the duty of every man engaged in it to tell the part he bore in the battles, its marches, and its trials and sacrifices. Added to this ordinary claim, there arises a yet further and greater obligation upon the Southern soldier. He fought not only in a holy cause, but he had behind him the greatest and truest women who in any age or clime inspired men to gallant and courageous deeds. No women ever made greater sacrifices than the women of the Confederacy. They hoped against hope, bore starvation, want, and the dangers of a slave uprising without murmur or complaint. They not only gave husbands and sons to fight, but they denied themselves the necessaries of life to feed those who were in the trenches or in the line at the front. More than a third of a century has passed since the war ended. 3/5 of the survivors sleep the sleep of death. Age is touching all who made the supreme record which belongs to Confederate men and women. The youngest are now approaching 80 years. The death rate increases with each passing month. And in the name of truth, quickened by a loving and tender pride, the children of the South cry out with earnest and deepest love that their fathers of the Confederacy shall tell us what they did, how they suffered, and how grandly they fought, and how faithfully they contended for the liberty of their country and its people. These warriors, these heroes, these noble women owe something to their descendants. They may not give us wealth, but they give us something nobler than money. They give us a precious inheritance of manly courage, of highest consecration to duty, of purest patriotism, of most unselfish and self-denying devotion to a holy cause. And we pray them in the name of truth, in the name of honor, in the name of true greatness, to give and leave with us a history of what was done by them in the great conflict they carried on against overwhelming odds to win nationhood and independence for our dear, dear Southland.
John, and this leads toward Carrie telling us what those tenets are. It seems like a strange name to give something that you're in favor of. You know, it's sort of focusing on the lost part of it seems like a kind of an admission of defeat in a
The way I've interpreted it and seen it a lot in publications of the time is an ironic use. More often than not, the lost cause was a foil for it's lost, but it really can't be lost because what is right, that defeated but not dishonored masthead, is a foil for making the very point that you're implying, that yes, lost in the literal sense, but not lost because it was wrong. But that's probably a good segue for Carrie.
Yeah, I tend to think about 5 tenets of the lost cause. And those are first and foremost that the Civil War was not about slavery, that it was a constitutional struggle over states' rights. That Confederate soldiers had fought honorably and bravely. That they had not lost, they had not been defeated on the battlefield, but turning to what the first panel this morning talked about, that they were simply overwhelmed by superior manpower, northern manpower and materiel.
that with the insurmountable numbers and materiel and men, that if they hadn't been fighting for something so right, that they believed in so deeply, they would have been foolish to have launched upon the war.
And for which they had no choice but to accept war. I mean, in retrospect, I think the way that we usually teach the war, whether it be in the classroom or in museums, usually you lay out the objective strength of each side, the manpower, the populations, the manufacturing capability, and just that. You say they'd be fools to accept this. And then when you get to the end of the war and start talking about overwhelming numbers, we never had a chance, then it sort of raises the question of why the heck did they ever accept war if they knew that this was the inevitable outcome? And what kind of moral culpability is there to have
That's the real problem.
accepted a war that they knew was they were doomed from the start, and they put, to kind of paraphrase Mary Chestnut, they put everything at risk by accepting war or firing the first shot, whichever way you wish to portray it. But they put everything at risk. They risked all and they lost all. They hastened the end of the very civilization that they were trying to perpetuate and to save. And it's not only foolish, but it looks like they bear an incredible moral culpability for all that death and destruction by accepting a fight that they knew full well they couldn't win.
And that's why they don't blame themselves for starting the war. They praise themselves for fighting it so well once it comes to them because of Abraham Lincoln's arrogance.
briefly talk about just how dramatic the shift of ground on the importance of slavery. I mean, compare what they're saying during the secession crisis, the run-up to Sumter and beyond, and what they say retrospectively on slavery and on the question of whether this was an impossible, just those two things.
So certainly during the war, and if we look at the Confederate Constitution, I mean, the Confederate Constitution is written to protect slavery, to ensure that this is a slave-holding republic. If we look at the commissioners, Charles Dew's book, Apostles of Disunion, is a fantastic little book that gives us a look at what these commissioners are saying from the Deep South as they go to Virginia and Tennessee and elsewhere, trying to convince the Upper South states to secede. And it's all about the language of slavery. It's all about protecting slavery. And race relations. And miscegenation and all the horrible things that are going to happen. Now, to be fair, Democrats in the North are using some of the same language to warn about the Republican Party just prior to the 1860 election. But there's no doubt in the minds of secessionists in 1860, 1861, that slavery is at the heart of this.
They're not embarrassed about slavery.
Not embarrassed in the slightest. This is very much something that they are willing to stake everything on, whether or not Congress has the power to control slavery in the territories. And if the Republican Party comes to power and does that, then are they going to extend their reach to where slavery already exists? I mean, there's a real palpable fear.
Well,